Hello, welcome, and thank you for joining us. I am Susan Winkler and have the privilege of serving as the Chief Executive Officer of the Reagan-Udall Foundation for the FDA. The FDA Foundation is pleased to host this important discussion about recent draft guidance from the agency on the topic of real-world data. Thank you for joining us. We have a little bit of housekeeping to cover first. First, we have over 1,000 people registered for today's workshop, and we are so pleased that you could all join us. The recording from today's meeting and the slides will be posted on the Foundation's website after the meeting. For those of you who submitted questions as part of the registration process, thank you. We have those, and I'll be raising as many of those as we can in the Q&A session of the webinar. Then, as many of you know, but it's important to underscore, speakers today will not be discussing any specific regulatory actions or decisions in today's discussion. And speaking of that discussion, we welcome your active engagement. Please submit questions or comments using the Zoom Q&A, and I'll encourage you after today's session to submit your comments and questions about the draft guidance to the Federal Register. The docket number is on this slide and in other meeting materials. Now, before we dive in, let me give you a brief overview of the agenda because we are going to cover a lot in the next 59 minutes. In just a moment, Dr. John Concato will provide some opening remarks. Then we'll have an overview of the draft guidance from Dr. Mike Blum and Dr. Wei Hua. Then we'll have a discussion with our team from FDA. So let's just remind ourselves for why we are all here today. And that's that FDA released this draft guidance on the topic of real-world data, assessing electronic health records and medical claims data to support regulatory decision-making for drug and biological products. The agency wants to hear comments and questions from the public, so please submit yours to the Zoom Q&A box here or to the docket listed on the screen. And with that, we are going to stay a little bit ahead of schedule and jump right into the substance. So I'm going to turn it over to our first speaker, who is Dr. John Concato. Dr. Concato serves as the Associate Director for Real-World Evidence Analytics in the Office of Medical Policy at the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research at FDA. And I'll note, John, I gave the whole explanation of CDER and FDA, and for the rest of the conversation, we're going to use abbreviations and acronyms for those. But with that, John, I'm going to turn it over to you for a brief overview.
Thanks very much, Susan. And I'll add my welcome to everyone joining today's webinar. As Susan mentioned, we're here today to discuss what we call in short, our EHR claims draft guidance. And as mentioned, I'm John Concato in the Office of Medical Policy. So really for the next few minutes, I'll just provide an overview of the session itself. Next slide, please. Many of you who work with real-world data, real-world evidence will have seen this slide before, including the 21st Century Cures Act, of course, of 2016, and FDA establishing a program to evaluate the use of real-world evidence for new indication of approved drugs or for post-approval requirements. We just want to emphasize, as you know, that our substantial evidence standard remains unchanged, and we've delivered on our RWE commitments under PDUFA 6, as we're right around the corner from PDUFA 7. We did publish a real-world evidence framework in 2018, and we're here today to discuss guidance released at the end of September, with, importantly, other guidance in development. Next slide. As a reminder, the FDA framework from 2018, as well as the guidance that we're discussing, pertains to drugs and biologics, but not to devices. And I'll also mention a big picture point to provide additional context that CDER and CBER's real-world evidence program also includes internal agency processes, external stakeholder engagement, demonstration projects, and next, obviously, guidance development, which is what we're here to talk about. And I will say the recent and current activities in this space might be described as representing an inflection point in the era of real-world evidence at FDA, so we're pleased to be here today. Next. I'll also point out that CDER's 2021 guidance agenda, which is available publicly and is shown in part here, lists 4 real-world evidence-related draft guidance documents. Next. with the EHR claims guidance being the focus of today's webinar, obviously. Draft guidance on data standards as well, right above the bullet with the arrow, was released, as you undoubtedly know, at the end of October, and will be the focus of a future webinar. And we can anticipate future guidance and webinars on registries, as well as regulatory considerations as shorthand versions of those two remaining guidances on the slide, as well as other topics not shown in the coming months. Next slide. As my last slide, this is a snapshot, obviously, of the title page of the draft EHR claims guidance. And I just want to emphasize a few big picture points before passing the baton to my colleagues from the Office of Surveillance and Epidemiology at CDER. First, and as mentioned, other guidance is pending. So this guidance does not note excessive details with regard to study design, for example, but that's by design, not by oversight. Second, and recognizing that guidance from FDA can sometimes be interpreted or sometimes over-interpreted, but we want it to be clear that this is our current thinking, and we're also encouraging long-term improvements in real-world data and real-world evidence, which will help us all. And then last, we look forward to your input today. And as Susan mentioned as well, we look forward to comments received in the docket on this guidance. So with that, and running a little bit ahead of schedule to leave time for what's to follow, I'll say thank you very much and pass it along to Mike.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Concato. And we will move into the discussion here. I'm struck that calling this an inflection point in real world data and real world evidence really does put that great description out, and so that we understand while there are a lot of inflection points, there are fewer in regulatory policy and regulatory approach than we might think, and so really important as we think about this suite of guidances. So I'm going to introduce our next set of speakers who will provide an overview of the draft guidance. Joining us, we have two individuals from the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research at FDA. First is Dr. Mike Blum, who is Deputy Director of the Office of Pharmacovigilance and Epidemiology, and then Dr. Wei Hua, who is the Supervisory Associate Director in Oncology and RWE in the Division of Epidemiology 1 in the Office of Pharmacovigilance and Epidemiology. I will turn the microphones over to Dr. Blum and Dr. Hua. Take it away and introduce us to this guidance.
Okay, thank you, Susan. So Wei Hua and I are both from the Office of Surveillance and Epidemiology within CDER, and we'll be providing a high-level overview of the guidance. Next slide, please. The guidance focuses on the reliability and relevance of real-world data, not real-world evidence, real-world data, and it addresses the selection of data sources, development and validation of definitions, and data provenance and quality. It does not, however, address study design or statistical analysis issues, and the real-world data issues discussed in the guidance are agnostic to study design. Next slide, please. This guidance complements a guidance that was issued in 2013 on best practices for conducting and reporting pharmacoepidemiologic safety studies using electronic healthcare data. It expands on certain aspects of that guidance relating to the selection of data sources and providing additional guidance that's applicable to studies of product effectiveness. Next slide, please. So this is the table of contents from the guidance. And I want to first point out that there's a glossary at the end of the guidance, which hopefully provides useful definitions for you of applicable terms in the guidance. For this presentation, we plan to focus on sections 4 and 5, data sources and study design elements. Next slide, please. Now, designing a fit-for-purpose study is like building a tower. The key elements relevant to the study question, which I'll call the building blocks of the study, must be adequately captured and of sufficient quality to build a structurally sound tower. Next slide, please. So in the data sources section, which is section 4, FDA does not endorse one data source over another or seek to limit the possible sources of data that may be relevant to answering the study questions. FDA recommends providing the reason for selecting the particular data sources to address the study question, as well as background information about the healthcare system from which the data are derived. If a non-US data source is selected, it would be important to explain the generalizability of the results to the US population. FDA also recommends addressing the comprehensiveness of the data sources in capturing care and outcomes relevant to the study question, and how all relevant populations, exposures, outcomes, and covariates will be captured during the study period. Next slide, please. There are sections in the guidance on data linkage and distributed data networks, and I'm not going to go into detail regarding those sections, but I do want to emphasize the importance of linking data from multiple data sources or study sites, and for distributed data networks, the inclusion of appropriate data elements in the common data model in order to capture the necessary data elements to address the study question. The data sources section of the guidance discusses appropriate data curation to address duplication or fragmentation issues, and refers to section 6, which goes into much more detail regarding data quality during the steps of data accrual, curation, and transformation into the final study-specific data set. I'm not planning to go into detail on section 6, but on the next slide, I just wanted to show you a figure that's used. It's an illustrative example of the life cycle of EHR data that's used in section 6 to walk through the steps in the process. And with that, I'll pass the baton to my colleague Wei Hua for an overview of section 5 of the guidance.
Thank you, Mike. Next slide, please. Next slide. Yeah, thanks. Yeah. So I'm going to provide an overview of section 5 on study design elements, and we'll begin with a few key messages from this section. So the study questions of interest should always be established first, and then the data source and the study design that are most appropriate for addressing these questions should be determined. The study should not be designed to fit a specific data source. This is because the limitations of a specific data source may restrict the options for study design and limit the inferences that can be drawn. For all studies using EHR or claims data that will be submitted to FDA to support a regulatory decision, sponsors should submit the protocols and SAP before conducting the study. All essential elements of study design, analysis, conduct, and reporting should be predefined. And then for each study element, the protocol and the final study report should describe how the element was ascertained from the selected RWD source, including the applicable validation study. Next slide, please. So here are the key study design elements discussed in section 5. Specifically, considerations should be given to the definition of time periods, selection of study population, and ascertainment and the validation of exposure, outcome, and covariates. Next slide, please. For variable ascertainment and the validation, there are two important variable definitions. The conceptual definition is intended to minimize the effect of variability in practice by different physicians and over time. So this definition should reflect the current medical and scientific thinking regarding the variable of interest, such as clinical criteria to define a condition for population selection or as an outcome of interest or of covariate, or a measurement of drug intake, including dose, frequency, duration, or other characteristics to define an exposure of interest. The conceptual definition is selected by the researcher for the particular study, so it may vary by study. Operational definition should be developed based on the conceptual definition to extract the most complete and accurate data from the data source. So this definition could be a code-based algorithm using structured data elements, or be derived from extracting relevant information from unstructured data, or constructing an algorithm that combines structured and unstructured data elements, or through additional data collections such as patient survey. Next slide, please. To ascertain the variable of interest from RWD, it is important that the operational definition using diagnosis and procedure codes, lab tests and values, or unstructured data is developed based on the conceptual definition. When selecting the coding system and information to construct the operational definition, the impact on this classification should be considered. And the performance of an operational definition, such as positive predictive value or PPV, may vary substantially by data source and the study scenario and over time. So if the performance has been assessed in prior studies, the applicability to the proposed study should be justified. Next slide, please. Validation of key studies and elements is recommended in this guidance because operational definitions are usually imperfect. A resulting misclassification can lead to false positives and false negatives, and there may be biased association between exposure and outcome. To determine what variables might require validation and to what extent, a key step is to understand the implications of potential misclassification for study internal validity and study inference. Whereas internal validity should always be optimized, some misclassification might be tolerable depending on the study question and the regulatory purpose. FDA recommends using standardized validation processes. So for example, standardized tools, documentation, and training. This approach is critical for minimizing intra and inter-rater variability, especially for multi-site studies. Next slide, please. Regarding the extent of validation, complete verification of a study variable for every study subject is considered the most rigorous approach. Through complete verification of all positives and all negatives, the adjudicated subjects can be assigned an accurate value of the variable to minimize misclassification and improve internal validity. Next slide. Another approach for validation is to assess the performance of an operational definition. It should be noted that although sensitivity, specificity, and the predicted values reflect performance, they don't ensure accurate classification of cases and non-cases. Rather, these measures inform the degree of misclassification and facilitate the interpretation of results in the presence of misclassification. So based on the concern of false positives and false negatives, researchers should consider whether validating the variable to a greater extent, for example, adjudicating all positives or all negatives, is necessary. Next slide. Excuse me. In scenarios where complete verification is infeasible, FDA recommends assessing the performance of the variable's operational definition in an adequately large sample of the study population as part of the proposed study. If sponsors propose to use an operational definition that has been assessed in a prior study, ideally those assessed in the same data source and in a similar study population should be selected. More recent data may be needed if there are secular trends in disease, diagnosis, and coding behavior, and the quality of prior studies to establish sensitivity, specificity, and the predictive values should always be evaluated. Next slide. Overall, the extent of validation should be determined by the necessary level of certainty and the implication of potential misclassification on study inference. We strongly encourage sponsors to discuss the attributes of a particular study with the relevant FDA review division. Next slide. Section 5 also discussed the considerations for misclassification using outcome variable as an example. In general, researchers should consider the trade-off between false positive and false negative cases when selecting an operational definition. To determine if an operational definition with a high PPV might be adequate for the proposed study, the extent of false positive cases and the extent of false negative cases should be evaluated. Also, the interplay of differences in sensitivity, specificity, and disease prevalence between the exposure groups should be carefully considered when evaluating the direction and the magnitude of bias. Next slide. Differential outcome misclassification might be minimized in studies in which the exposure status is blinded. However, even when data collection methods seem to preclude the likelihood of differential misclassification, non-differential misclassification is not guaranteed in the actual data of a particular study. Therefore, the direction of bias might remain unpredictable. Another consideration is about dependent versus independent misclassification. When more than one misclassification exists in a study, how they might be related to each other should be considered. FDA recommends consideration of quantitative bias analysis to demonstrate whether and how potential bias might affect study results. Next slide. Regarding time-related data, FDA recommends clearly defining the various time periods pertinent to the study design in the protocol. The time scale, for example, on kind of time, age, or time since exposure should be explicitly described with adequate detail on data availability of the time unit that is required to answer the study question. The protocol should justify the proposed time periods and the potential impact on study validity. For example, justification should be provided regarding whether the time period before exposure is appropriate for capturing study variables, or whether the potential temporal changes in the standard of care, the availability of other treatments, diagnosis criteria, or other relevant factors could be properly addressed. When considering outcome definition, timing of disease onset may need to be distinguished from a confirmed diagnosis. When defining the beginning and the end of the follow-up time for outcome assessment, researchers should consider the biologically plausible time frame when the outcome, if associated with exposure, might be expected to occur. Next slide. To summarize, in general, data should be sufficiently accurate and complete to address the regulatory question. This guidance focuses on EHR and claims data, including considerations for potential biases that are directly related to the accuracy and the completeness of study design elements. To facilitate FDA review, the protocol should provide a detailed description and a justification of the selection of data source and ascertainment and the validation of study design elements. Discussion with the relevant FDA review division early in the application process is strongly encouraged. It should be noted that this guidance is about data considerations. Data alone are not evidence. Relevant and reliable data must be used in conjunction with appropriate study design and analysis. So this brings us to the end of this presentation. Next slide, please. We would like to acknowledge our colleagues from FDA, CDER, CBER, CDRH, and OCE, who made invaluable contributions to the development of this guidance. All the information presented here is a product of the work group. Thank you.
Thanks, Wei, and thanks, Mike. Mike, do you want to kind of wrap up that presentation part, and then we'll jump into our Q&A section with our panelists?
Sure, absolutely. I want to explain why we focused on these two sections of the guidance, the data sources and the study elements. And it's primarily because these sections are likely to generate the most questions. And as you'll see from the tenor of the questions, these are the two sections that probably require the most clarity. So we are encouraging you to submit comments and so that we could make this as clear as possible in our final guidance.
Great, thanks so much, Mike. I'm going to venture that folks were intuiting that, but it's also just good to know that you recognize that those are the components of the guidance that might benefit most from having a bit of a spotlight and additional explanation. So thank you for providing that. I also want to note, as a reminder, the slides will be posted at the Foundation's website at the conclusion of the webinar. So those will be available, and we'll also be posting a recording of the webinar if there's a piece that you want to go back and capture. Mike, I'm going to confirm that in my head, the building block idea is definitely going to resonate and help folks think through what it is that we're looking here in evaluating the real world data. As we said, though, we're going to turn to our panel to address some question and answers. So I'm going to ask
Susan.
Yes,
sorry to interrupt.
John, please.
I thought I would echo what Wei and Mike said, and just to acknowledge, especially if anyone attending the webinar did not read the guidance ahead of time, then there was an awful lot of material, but that's good. We wanted to have you hear the guidance, so to speak, from the team that put together the guidance so that it becomes more sort of intuitive in terms of what we're thinking. But I also want to emphasize the idea that sponsors, stakeholders can help us by, I use the phrase homework, I'm doing that intentionally. In other words, if a development program does their homework according to the general principles of epidemiology, or I might say clinical epidemiology, then a lot of this material, right, will make sense. So we have our regulations, of course, to abide by, but at the end of the day, when it's about the science, we need to be convinced, and the review divisions, it's a case-by-case basis, of course, but there's an awful lot that could be done before the submission reaches our door to try to make it as strong as possible. So we trust that this guidance will be helpful, and we wanted to be here today, as mentioned, to provide some additional richness, quote unquote, to what's on the printed page. So thank you, Susan.
Excellent, and it helps. We know the world has the visual learners and the auditory learners and the feeling learners, and although we're in a virtual environment, this helps us go a bit beyond the words on the page and try to reach a greater audience of folks who are interested in the document. So thank you, and let's go to this panel piece. So I'm going to pull back up or push back up, whatever direction it is, to bring to the spotlight Drs. Blum, Hua, and Concato, and we're going to introduce a new individual from FDA to join our discussion. And specifically, I want to welcome Dr. Natasha Pratt, who will join us. And Dr. Pratt is the acting team leader and senior epidemiologist in the Division of Epidemiology 2 in the Office of Pharmacovigilance and Epidemiology. So with that, and we have all these up, and I will note, actually, you probably all already know this, that you win for longest titles at FDA, and there is really fierce competition across the agency for that, with number of characters that are involved, but it's also helpful to know where you sit within the centers. So with that, let's go to this panel discussion, and this is from a number of questions that were submitted beforehand, as well as are continuing to come in through the Zoom Q&A, and I invite folks to continue to submit them there. The first one on my list, I'm going to go, Mike, I'm going to send this to you. What is the role of sponsors when considering using RWD or real world evidence to support new indications for drugs? So I should say real world data and real world evidence to support new indications for drugs. Would you pick that up?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So when sponsors propose using real world data or real world evidence in a clinical study for regulatory purposes, they need to carefully consider how the selected data source, which this guidance goes into detail on, in conjunction with the a robust study design and analysis can be optimized so that they minimize bias and generate valid results to answer the regulatory question. The bottom line is we encourage sponsors to engage with FDA early when considering using RWE to support a regulatory claim.
I think, which is advice consistent across interaction with the agency, right? That early conversations can be very helpful in making sure that you're headed in the right direction with the right parameters. So true here in the RWE standpoint as well. So let's then go to, I've got such a rich set of questions here. All right, the next one, let's talk about exploring outcomes in electronic health record or claims data. I think we know that certain outcomes, some cardiovascular events, for example, may be well captured in EHR or claims data. Will FDA consider more use of RWD for outcomes like that? And Wei, could you pick that one up?
Sure. Thank you for the question. I would also like to take the opportunity to highlight a few concepts here. So when appropriate, RWD can inform regulatory decision-making. That includes use of RWD capturing study endpoints. But considerations for relevant and reliable RWD in regulatory decision-making is not restricted to a particular therapeutic area, safety versus effectiveness, or any specific outcome. So as noted in our guidance, a particular outcome captured from RWD starts with a clinical concept, and then that concept must be operationalized. So we need to understand the data to support operationalizing those outcomes and understand the sensitivity and the specificity of the definition and the extent of misclassification. So those are the very important considerations when we consider what outcomes and what data are appropriate.
Really helpful. And I see, Dr. Pratt, do you want to jump in on that one as well?
Yes, I would just want to elaborate a little bit from what Wei has said. So like, let's say if the RWE study evaluated a clinical outcome that has previously validated outcome algorithm, such as those for the CV events, one might demonstrate outcome validity by using published study with a justification for why the finding are applicable to the specific data source that will be used or was used for the current study. However, RWE should be derived from a study where both the selected data source in conjunction with the study design and analysis can adequately address the scientific question. So the capability of capturing outcome well is really one aspect of that consideration. So I just want to reiterate what Mike has mentioned earlier, that we would really encourage sponsors to initiate discussion with the relevant FDA review division early in the application process when they considering using RWE.
And Susan, can I also weigh in on this, even though—
Please do.
I mean,
Yeah.
I agree with everything that's been said, but I just wanted to link back to some of my introductory comments. I mean, you know, we talked about cardiovascular here. Let's say that that lends itself on average a bit more readily than other areas. We wouldn't want sponsors in those other areas to feel like, oh my goodness, what about us? I think what we're doing here is we're advancing one step at a time. Success begets success. And even if it's not a direct parallel, lessons learned in one field will also be applicable undoubtedly in another field, maybe not as fast as everyone would like, but so be it. I think this also gives me an opportunity to maybe, well, it's not putting in a plug. We've already supported our FDA demonstration projects, but to those who are involved with those demonstration projects external to FDA, we say thank you very much. But one way to look at it is that we put those demonstration projects in categories, loose informal categories of being related to improving real world data, aspects of real world evidence, quote unquote, design, or maybe a third category of tools. And my connection here is in that first category or bucket. in terms of real world data, as time goes by, the reliability and relevance of real world data in the field should improve. And therefore, the ability to go from where we are, say today, to the finish line will be a shorter distance in the future, because the quality of, quote unquote, quality of real world data will be enhanced. So I know that sounds aspirational, it is, but it's also realistic as opposed to just a hypothetical, and that there is ongoing work on a day-to-day basis. And I could name projects and names, but I'd rather not and offend anyone who I don't list, but we have upwards of 20 demonstration projects, either completed, ongoing, or getting started. So we are more than cautiously optimistic. We are optimistic that over time, what's in the EHR or claims data themselves will be more applicable to the issues that Mike, Wei, and Natasha so nicely described. Thank you.
And John, it strikes me as you were kind of giving those examples, it strikes me as a learning I think you've seen in the work in the COVID-19 evidence accelerator, right? Where the early on, the teams were like, it's really important to dig in and know the data and understand what's there, what's not, what can you learn from it? And I think you're saying that's applicable more broadly. It's not just what you might learn from the COVID-19 data, but more broadly in all of the projects that you have ongoing.
Yes, thank you, Susan.
Great. We have this list of questions, so let me go to another one. This one narrows to EHR data. And the question is that some EHR database providers use technology-enabled abstraction to conduct medical record review for key variables using standardized processes. Can we consider variables that are abstracted in this way to have been validated via complete verification, provided that there are descriptions of the medical record review processes, the kappa statistics, and et cetera, as long as they're included? Dr. Pratt, do you want to pick that one up, Natasha?
Sure. So I want to answer this question by first clarifying some key aspects of complete outcome verification or validation. So the purpose of doing so is to minimize bias due to outcome misclassification in the particular data source that will be or was used for the proposed RWD study. So if the proposed technology-enabled method, such as computable phenotype, has been demonstrated to have adequate accuracy, we feel additional validation might still be needed. Really depends on how well the prior demonstration can be applicable to the clinical setting of the research question and or the data source of the proposed RWD.
So we'll need some connection of what you've done before with what you want to do today. Is that a way to think about it?
Exactly. It's just whether the prior demonstration, whether it's in the data source that's really apply and in the clinical setting that applicable to the data source and setting where those data come from for your current study, whether it can be generalizable there, because we really want to know is the validity of those outcomes in the data source, the source data that you have to conduct your study.
And Natasha, would you agree it's a combination of, say, a clinical judgment involved as well as a methodologic judgment involved, right? That's what I hear you saying. I know that sounds very high level, but it's true that it's not a vacuum of design and data. It's also not as simple as saying, well, we as clinicians know what's going to happen. It's rather the bridging both of those realms and having a thoughtful, honest assessment, a serious assessment of what the strengths and limitations are. Is that fair?
Yes, and I really want to give some example, but I don't want to be very specific because we want to be on high level. So for example, if you use an algorithm that's to pick up certain disease progression, but the demonstration was done in inpatient setting, then the current study you want to do is actually to examine the treatment for this disease in an outpatient setting that's in a different disease stage, then whether that's marker for severity that's built up in the inpatient setting using inpatient record, whether that's applicable to outpatient electronic medical record in the outpatient setting, that need to be discussed, because basically patient that in the stage can be seen as outpatient, and those with the same disease that need inpatient care, they are different clinically. So what marker that you can pick up as progression of the disease would be different. So that's kind of as specific I can get right now, but I think that's where the clinical judgment comes from in terms of applying a previously developed algorithm to your current study.
That's a really helpful illustration, Natasha. Thank you.
Sorry to interrupt, Susan.
Yeah,
before we go on,
ahead.
I'm asking you a question in this case. Is it fair to say, well, first a statement. These questions are fantastic. Thanks everyone so much. And we'll use all of the time in the webinar to answer them. But we also want to emphasize that the docket, the Federal Register approach, is the formal official. So we wouldn't want anyone to think that because they're asking a question today, I mean, we'll remember it, we won't forget. But please recognize the official pathway here is to use the docket, and we will have sufficient, we will make sufficient person hours worth of time available to go through each and every question and make sure that our conversion from a draft guidance to a final guidance respects all of the input that is provided. So thanks. Does that resonate with you, Susan? Does that pass?
Absolutely, right? In that, but underscoring when the agency issues a draft guidance, I can say that because I'm not inside the agency. I'll say when you issue a draft guidance, you want the feedback to improve it for the final version, and that includes, right, some of these questions that the discussion today might inspire, as well as thoughts for solutions.
Thank you.
Yeah, great. Well, as you mentioned, we have questions to move through. So let me go to the next one, which actually, John, it's coming back to you. And this is important kind of as we think more broadly about health equity. And so this one focuses on that. What are the implications for health equity and assessing the effectiveness and safety of medical products on more diverse populations to those that are typically enrolled in clinical trials?
Great question, thank you. And obviously it goes beyond the scope of the guidance, but that's great. Well, first I should say that FDA has been supporting various initiatives that really seek to promote diversity in clinical trials, right? That's a topic of its own. It's been presented in different venues. And of course, this commitment that we have to diversity extends to what I'll call non-interventional, aka observational studies as well. So we are sincere in this effort. And one could say that it's often true that data that come from so-called real-world data sources, say from healthcare systems, tend to, by their nature, involve more diverse patient populations than at least some clinical trials, right? If they're conducted at selected sites, we could talk about tertiary medical centers. And, again, this topic could take up an hour, a half day, a week-long seminar. So I would say, though, on balance, on average, with a bunch of caveats, that the implications are positive, if I could use that phrasing, in terms of real-world data in the long run improving health equity by the very nature of having more representative, more diverse study populations. It doesn't mean that clinical trials can't or won't do that, but it is good news. But at the same time, just to keep it real, right, our evidentiary standards, as I mentioned, for regulatory decision-making remain unchanged. And at the end of the day, not only do we need valid evidence to make appropriate decisions as a regulatory agency, but I think as a society, as a patient, from a public health point of view, we want valid real-world evidence when regulatory agencies make those decisions for all the obvious reasons. So again, it was sort of a big picture question. I'm providing an answer at a big picture level, but I hope the core take-home message is clear that FDA is committed and that we do see a path forward in the real world data, real world evidence space in this regard. Thank you.
And John, if I could, is there also then the situation kind of in what we learn from different evaluations of real world data can help enhance and improve the clinical trials and perhaps improve our efforts to have more diverse clinical trials and enhance the health equity in those?
Yes, and actually this gives me a chance, sorry if I say this more than once in different venues, but let's remember, right, that real world data can and are used in clinical trials, right? There's a full, not that you're saying this, Susan, I know you know, but there's sort of this oversimplified dichotomy of like randomized trials versus observational studies, and sometimes real world data, real world evidence is slotted as a synonym for observational studies. The dichotomy itself is false, but leaving aside the fact that we can have real world data, say in so-called pragmatic trials, et cetera, yes, just having study populations, say the same drug outcome association is being looked at, and I think we'll, from a holistic sort of 30,000 foot view level, we will have a better appreciation of that so-called landscape vis-a-vis diversity. So yes, your point is well taken, that this will be hopefully a positive feedback loop, if I could invoke that phrase, to sort of improve health equity across the board.
Great, thank you. And thank you as well for the reminder that it's the same regulatory standard. You know, we know in some of the research that's been done since the release of the authorization and then approval of the COVID-19 vaccines that there's been you know, a bit of attention in some of the traditionally underserved communities. They wanted to know that it was the same standard and in fact that they were getting the same vaccine that others were. And so it's an important part of continuing to build that trust that we speak to the need to improve the equity in our clinical trials, in the use of real world data and application of real world evidence while maintaining that same standard. So thanks for taking the broader question there.
No, my pleasure. And by the way, while that, you know, that is a reality, I think we have shown in recent months that it's also doable. It won't happen overnight. And I think there might be in some corners unrealistic expectations, but on the other hand, we also are aware the other end of the distribution is if there shouldn't be undue skepticism about the ability of real world data or real world evidence to contribute to regulatory decision making while maintaining the evidence standards, as you and I are saying, Susan. So thank you.
Great. So I'm looking at the questions here, and I want to pivot us to talk about drug safety. So I'm going to open this up to any of the panelists who want to unmute or raise their hand. Who wants to pick up the microphone and comment on the use of real world evidence for drug safety?
I think I'll take that one, Susan.
All right, it's yours.
So FDA has been using real world evidence to address safety questions for a long time, long before the 21st Century Cures Act. You know, I think, as you know, the FDA Sentinel system's been an integral part of post-market safety assessment for years. And while the recent dialogue has really focused on RWE for efficacy, RWE is by no means new to the FDA. And as I mentioned in my talk, this guidance complements the 2013 pharmacoepidemiologic guidance that is focused on pharmacoepidemiology studies for safety. The EHR claims guidance complements it by adding considerations with regard to relevance and reliability of EHR and claims data, and then also includes some discussion of effectiveness.
So deep history in safety, and then here's some of that expansion, but continuing to have the application in the safety world as well.
That's right.
All right. We've got about 10 minutes left, so I want to make sure that we get to a few more of these questions. Dr. Hua, I'm going to send this to your way. In thinking about an analysis plan, does the analysis plan need to be finalized before receiving data from the sites? then with an observation that doing that would delay the conduct of the study. So, any thoughts on that?
Sure. I want to say that before initiating study, it is critical for sponsors to develop a study protocol in the pre-specified SAP. The reason is FDA must be confident that particular data sets were not chosen and a certain analysis were not selected to favor a certain conclusion. That's very important.
Great. So reminding that in fact, it is about avoiding a post hoc, oh, I think this might work, but in the very specific structure of here's what we're planning to do in this data set, and then seeing what happens. So maybe with Mike, I might steal your analogy here. If we're going to use the building blocks, we should know the building blocks and how they're going to be connected and evaluated versus kind of mixing them up in the middle.
Exactly, yes. So we want to make sure that the results were not cherry picking. Everything is planned ahead of time.
Right, I mean, it should be evident, right? Things can go wrong in clinical trials. They usually don't, but having that prospective infrastructure and having the data being collected, there's a lot of oversight. Here, the drug of interest, right? The test article is given in routine medical practice, and that occurred in its own environment. But between that point and the database, and between the database being collected and the analysis, is where we just have to be realistic that many different permutations, so to speak, many different scenarios, different covariates, et cetera, could be tried. So in the name of validity, in the name of transparency, and again, getting the right answer to these questions, we expect the sponsors of the stakeholder community to do the right thing and to show us how they've done the right thing.
Great, which is a specific plan.
Exactly.
Ahead of time. All right. Well, so we've gone from kind of really big picture questions to some more narrow questions. This one is maybe a little bit in the middle. So let me call up the question, and then we'll see who wants to pick this up. So it's a reality that some source data capture and processing for these real world data sources for EHRs and claims is usually performed by the data providers or data aggregators and analyzers, but not the product sponsor, not the biopharmaceutical company. With that, the question is, it would be helpful to understand how FDA plans to review confidential information that may only be available to the data providers and not the drug sponsors. Oh, good, John, you unmuted. I'm gonna let you pick that one up.
Thanks for the softball lob question here, Susan. Not exactly, right? No, it's an important question. And again, if I said earlier, we're at an inflection point, I think we're also early in the real world evidence era where inflection points have to occur. I don't want to overuse that figure of speech here. But I think at the end of the day, what we could say now is when using real world data to support regulatory decision making, we really need sponsors to ensure that the patient level data sets, that the data sets at the patient level, right? The patient level data are submitted to FDA in accordance with legal and regulatory requirements. Those requirements don't go away just because it's real world data and not a trial. So we encourage data providers and sponsors to consider whatever agreements might be necessary to ensure that the data can be provided in the marking application the way we need it. And also, by the way, that FDA has access to source records for inspection, which is another component that hasn't come up, but will come up in due course in any drug development program. So we also, I think this is a chance to mention, I'm not advertising for next month, but that our stakeholders should be aware of and should consider what's in the so-called data standards draft guidance that was released in October. Again, it applies to drug and biologic products, but that contains useful information as well. Again, we have a series, a portfolio, a suite of guidances under the real world data, real world evidence umbrella, and we're working very hard to have them work effectively as standalone guidances, but they, at the end of the day, are also obviously linked. And in this case, when we're talking about, not so much the technical aspects of real world data, but how this works in the real world. Sorry about that lame pun, but clearly the data standards guidance is a complement to the EHR claims guidance, so they should be considered together. And the data standards guidance is overarching. It applies to registries guidance that I mentioned is on the 2021 CEDAR guidance agenda. And if we have other guidances that are in the pipeline, we do. They can remain nameless for now, but the data standards would also apply to them. So we view that as a distinctive guidance in terms of its generalizability, if I can use that term.
So since Mike took our building blocks idea and applied it to real world data, we'll have to use something other than building blocks to show the connectivity of the guidances. But I think you're saying here that they stand alone, but they also weave together. And so we'll want to, as the agency is continuing to provide helpful input through the guidance, then we'd also invite commenters you would welcome them to say, all right, how do they see them working together? Because it may just be different when you're looking at it from the regulated industry shoes versus the regulator perspective.
Exactly, thank you.
All right, so we have time for one last question. And so this one, it's another, well, it's kind of a big question. So who would like to speak to highlighting any changes from the prior FDA real world evidence framework released in December 2018 and what we're discussing today? And we don't have time to go line by line. So anybody want to kind of pick that up and help us see the highlights of those changes?
Well, if my colleagues don't mind, I'll volunteer first. Thanks to everyone involved, to you, Susan, and I know we're not wrapping up yet, but thanks to my colleagues in general, and also for allowing me to just take this one. Well, the prior FDA RWE framework, I will say it's the only FDA framework, right? It wasn't a guidance, but I think it served well from 2018 to now to sort of provide the overarching, path forward. For what we're going to do. I mentioned the internal agency processes, the external stakeholder engagement, which this could be considered an example of. I already alluded to demonstration projects, and last but not least, we have our guidance. All of these components were intended to work together to honor our congressional mandate to evaluate the potential use of real world evidence, right? We know that. So I would say the current guidance, as well as the other guidances that we've been referring to, please appreciate they represent the work product of the 2018 framework, right? That the framework held its ground and served us well the past 3 or so years. But now what we're doing is we're delivering on the work product that, in this case, helps sponsors understand what to do with EHR and claims data. It represents our current thinking, et cetera. And coming up next, we'll have the data standards guidance that will do the same. And then at the end of this series of guidances, and by the way, we need not wait, like just because there isn't a standalone guidance on design, again, as Mike says, as I said, we are agnostic to study design in the sense that any study design can work. We're not saying that each study design has the equal chance to start with for providing valid answers. So we have to be realistic, but we are not saying that EHR claims data, in this case, we say, well, it of course could be used in the trial. We're also saying, of course, it can be used in a non-interventional, also known as observational study design. So all of this comes together to deliver on what we said we would do. And we're pleased to be where we are at this point in time.
It's, I'm certain, was quite a day of celebration at FDA when you get the draft guidance across the finish line and out for public comment. So on that public comment, I want to remind everyone to submit your comments and questions about the draft guidance to the docket. We're going to close out the Q&A session and close out the webinar here. I will note, as was just mentioned, there is the second guidance that relates to data standards for drug and biologic product submissions containing real-world data. We'd love to see you back here on Friday, December 3rd to have a similar discussion about that guidance, and registration is open for that if you'd like to join us. So let me say thank you to all of our speakers for joining us today. It takes effort to shine the light on what it is that you're doing and to respond to the questions that come in. Thanks to the FDA Planning Committee members and to everybody in the audience for attending and submitting questions for the speakers. You've made my job easy by submitting great questions. With that, we'll say thank you so much. Take care, and we will hope to see you soon.
Thank you.